5:45 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The guided missile cruiser USS Philippine Sea was already at battle stations, its engines pushing the 9,000-ton warship through the dark water toward a point on the map. This was no longer a show of force or a routine presence mission in the Strait of Hormuz. The question that hung in the air was whether the Iranian coastal defense crews would realize their fate before the first wave of fire reached the horizon. The Gulf air was thick with salt and the heavy, oppressive humidity of a Middle Eastern spring, pressing against the steel hull like a physical weight. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was clinical and frozen. The air was kept at a constant 68 degrees to protect the massive banks of processors that fueled the Aegis combat system, creating a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat on the weather decks. The commanding officer stood in the center of the darkened room, his face illuminated by the pale blue light of the tactical displays that tracked every movement for 200 miles. For 3 days, the Iranian coastal radar network had been painting the cruiser with active pulses, a digital provocation that had finally crossed the line into a direct threat. Intelligence reports from the Fifth Fleet had confirmed that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had integrated their long-range surveillance with anti-ship cruise missile batteries. If the United States Navy intended to move the carrier strike group through the strait, these eyes had to be put out, and they had to be put out permanently. The cruiser was currently operating at coordinates 26 degrees 40 minutes north, 55 degrees 10 minutes east. On the main tactical screen, a series of red icons glowed like embers along the jagged coastline of the Iranian mainland. These represented the high-frequency and very high-frequency radar sites at Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, and the critical nodes at Bushehr. Each one of those red icons was a gateway for a swarm of shore-to-ship missiles that could saturate the defenses of even the most modern carrier. The mission, designated Operation Blind Eye, was straightforward in its objective, but surgical in its required execution. The USS Philippine Sea was to launch a coordinated strike using its primary offensive weapon, the Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, to decapitate the network in a single, overwhelming blow. Down in the bowels of the ship, the technicians of the weapons department were finalizing the mission profiles for 88 separate missiles. Each Tomahawk was a masterpiece of late-model engineering, a 20-foot-long cylinder of high explosives and sophisticated guidance systems. The missiles were housed in the Mark 41 vertical launch system, a grid of steel cells that dominated the forward and aft decks of the cruiser. The sailors in the Launch Control Center worked through their checklists with the rhythmic precision of a professional orchestra. They did not speak of the geopolitical consequences or the weight of the coming fire. They spoke only in the language of voltages, pressure seals, and GPS satellite locks. The smell of hydraulic fluid and the low-frequency vibration of the ship's gas turbine engines provided the background music to their preparation. The commanding officer looked at his watch, the seconds ticking away toward the 0 hour set by Central Command. He knew that once the first missile left the cell, there would be no turning back from the escalation that would follow. The Iranian radar operators were likely sitting in their bunkers, watching their screens and drinking tea, unaware that the data they were collecting was about to become their final transmission. The cruiser was now 60 miles off the coast, a distance that allowed the Tomahawks to stay low, hugging the wave tops to avoid detection until the final seconds of their flight. The ship felt alive, a predatory animal holding its breath before the strike. Every sensor and every sailor tuned to the same lethal frequency. A message flashed on the primary tactical console in high-priority white text, originating from the admiral aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. The authorization code was verified through a 3-step cryptographic process that took exactly 12 seconds. The commanding officer nodded once to the tactical action officer, a silent gesture that carried the weight of 100 tons of high explosives. The order was relayed through the internal communication circuits, reaching the launch teams in a fraction of a heartbeat. The ship's master clock showed exactly 6 in the morning on the 12th of March, 2026. The wait was over, and the silent Gulf was about to be torn apart by the sound of American power. 6:01 in the morning. The Central Persian Gulf. The USS Philippine Sea maintained its steady course, a steel shadow cutting through the oily swell of the sea. While the crew in the Launch Control Center awaited the final execution command, the strategic reality of the mission weighed heavily on the command staff. The Iranian Coastal Radar Network, often referred to by intelligence analysts as the Great Wall of Radar, was not merely a collection of sensors, it was a lethal, integrated shield. The air outside was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, damp heat that precedes a summer storm in the tropics. On the horizon, the first faint line of gray light began to separate the sky from the water, revealing a world that was about to be transformed by fire. For over a decade, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had invested billions of dollars into a layered surveillance architecture designed specifically to counter the United States Navy. At the heart of this network were the long-range Gadir and Separ radar systems, massive installations capable of detecting stealth aircraft and cruise missiles at ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers. These eyes allowed the Iranian military to track every movement of the Fifth Fleet from the moment a ship weighed anchor in Bahrain. More dangerously, these radars were linked via high-speed fiber optic cables to mobile anti-ship missile batteries hidden in the limestone sea caves along the coast. If the United States Navy attempted to transit the covetous Strait of Hormuz without first blinding these sensors, they would be walking into a kill zone where hundreds of missiles could be coordinated to strike a single target simultaneously. The tactical display in the Combat Information Center showed the true scale of the problem. From the port of Bandar Abbas in the east to the nuclear facility at Bushehr in the west, the Iranian coast was a continuous chain of electromagnetic energy. The Najm 82 phased array radars provided the mid-range tracking, while the Resonance NE systems were specifically tuned to look for the radar signatures of F-35 Lightning II fighters. The commanding officer of the USS Philippine Sea knew that as long as these systems were operational, the carrier strike group was effectively boxed in. The mission was not an act of aggression, but a necessary surgical removal of a threat that had become intolerable to the freedom of navigation in international waters. The plan for Operation Blind Eye had been refined over months of simulated war games at the Naval War College. It relied on the principle of mass precision. The 88 Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles assigned to the cruiser were not being fired at random. Each had a specific set of coordinates programmed into its internal memory. 42 of the missiles were designated for the primary radar emitters, while the remaining 46 were tasked with destroying the backup command and control bunkers and the power generation plants that fed the network. The goal was total systemic collapse, a digital decapitation that would leave the Iranian coastal defense forces blind, deaf, and unable to communicate with their missile batteries. Inside the ship, the sound of the ventilation system was a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones of the sailors. The heat of the electronics in the combat center was offset by the cold, dry air pumped in from the ship's cooling plants, creating an environment that felt artificial and disconnected from the natural world outside. Every man and woman on the bridge felt the tension of the coming minutes. They were operating within the place engagement envelope of the Iranian shore batteries, relying on their own Aegis combat system and the AN/SPY-6 radar to protect them if the enemy detected the launch and retaliated. The electronic warfare suite was already active, pumping out a subtle cloud of digital noise to mask the cruiser's exact position. But once the missiles left the vertical launch cells, the ship's location would be broadcast to every sensor in the region. The strategic stakes reached far beyond the Persian Gulf. In Washington and at the Indo-Pacific Command, leaders were watching the data feeds in real time. If the USS Philippine Sea succeeded, it would prove that the most sophisticated anti-access and area denial networks in the world could be dismantled by a single, well-placed surface combatant. If it failed, the strike group would be forced to retreat, handed a strategic defeat without a single shot being fired. The commanding officer gripped the edge of the command table, his knuckles white against the dark plastic. He looked at the digital countdown on the bulkhead. which showed exactly 4 minutes until the first salvo. The time for analysis was over. The time for the kinetic reality of the Tomahawk was seconds away. 6:03 in the morning. The central Persian Gulf. The USS Philippine Sea leaned into a sharp turn to starboard, its wake carving a massive, frothing white arc into the dark green surface of the water. The cruiser was now moving into the designated launch basket, a precisely calculated patch of ocean located 65 miles southwest of the Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas. The ship had increased its speed to 25 knots, the vibration of the 4 massive gas turbine engines humming through the deck plates and into the soles of the sailors' boots. Outside, the sun finally crested the horizon, casting a long, blood-red light across the calm water and illuminating the gray steel of the cruiser's superstructure. The air smelled of salt spray and the hot, metallic scent of diesel exhaust, a reminder of the raw power required to hold a position in these contested waters. In the Combat Information Center, the air was static with the sound of electronic data feeds and the hushed, rapid-fire reports of the radar operators. The AN/SPY-6 radar was operating in a low probability of intercept mode, its digital eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a counterattack. Suddenly, a series of small, jagged blips appeared on the primary tactical console, moving out from the Iranian coastline at high speed. These were not the large, lumbering hulls of the regular Iranian Navy, but the fast attack craft of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Intelligence called them the swarm small, fiberglass-hulled boats, armed with heavy machine guns and short-range rockets, designed to overwhelm a larger ship through sheer numbers. The tactical action officer called out the contacts with clinical detachment, his voice steady despite the growing threat. 32 separate surface contacts were now closing at a combined speed of 42 knots, their course set directly for the cruiser's estimated position. At their current rate of travel, they would be within visual range in less than 15 minutes. The commanding officer watched the icons move across the screen, his mind weighing the two-front engagement that was now unavoidable. He had to execute the primary Tomahawk strike against the radar network while simultaneously defending his ship against a swarm of suicide boats that could appear from any direction. The ship's defensive systems were brought to a higher state of readiness, the 5-inch gun on the forward deck tracking toward the nearest threat axis. The close-in weapon systems, the 20mm Gatling guns, known as phalanx, began their automated diagnostic cycles, their barrels tracking with a robotic, haunting precision. On the bridge, the lookouts squinted through high-powered binoculars, searching the hazy horizon for the white spray of the fast boat's wakes. The humidity of the Gulf created a shimmering mirage on the water, making it difficult to distinguish between the crests of the waves and the hulls of the approaching enemy. The tension on the bridge was a physical presence, a tightness in the chest of every sailor as they realized the enemy had anticipated their arrival. Despite the approaching swarm, the mission timeline for Operation Blind Eye remained unchanged. The tactical logic was clear. If the cruiser broke off its mission to engage the fast boats, the Iranian radar network would remain operational, and the carrier strike group would remain at risk. The USS Philippine Sea would have to hold its ground and fire its missiles while the swarm closed the distance. It was a calculated gamble, a test of the ship's ability to multitask in the most lethal environment imaginable. The weapons department reported that the mission data for the 88 Tomahawks was now fully synchronized with the satellite network. The coordinates for the launch point were reached at exactly 6:08 in the morning. The ship slowed its engines, settling into a stable firing platform, as the stabilizers worked to counter the gentle roll of the 2-meter swells. The coordinates were locked at 26 degrees, 42 minutes north, 55 degrees, 8 minutes east. The executive officer leaned into the internal communications handset, his voice echoing through every compartment of the 9,000-ton warship. He announced that the ship was entering the final launch sequence and that all non-essential personnel were to stay clear of the weather decks. The sound of the ship's heavy blast doors sealing shut rang out like the slamming of a vault, leaving the crew in a world of artificial light and high-stakes data. The commanding officer looked at the tactical display one last time, The Iranian fast boats were now only 12 miles away, their engines likely screaming at full throttle as they raced toward their target. Behind them, the Iranian radar sites continued to pulse, their beams sweeping across the ocean in a desperate search for the cruiser. The two forces were on a collision course, a digital and physical confrontation that would be decided in the next 60 seconds. The launch keys were inserted into the consoles in the Launch Control Center, the final physical barrier to the start of the war. The air in the room felt thin, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. 6:09 in the morning. The forward decks of the USS Philippine Sea. The steel surfaces of the Mark 41 vertical launch system were already warm to the touch, absorbing the early morning heat of the Persian Gulf. Beneath the 64 individual hatches of the forward deck, 88 Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles sat in their canisters, their internal guidance systems finalizing the mission data. The air above the launchers shimmered with a faint haze of heat, the smell of salt spray mixing with the industrial scent of the ship's anti-corrosive paint. Every 3 seconds, the ship's tactical data link refreshed, feeding the latest weather and atmospheric pressure readings into each missile's onboard computer. The Tomahawk Land Attack Missile was a weapon of incredible complexity, designed to fly at subsonic speeds while hugging the contours of the Earth. The mission profiles for Operation Blind Eye utilized two primary guidance technologies to ensure the destruction of the Iranian coastal radar network. The first, terrain contour matching, allowed the missiles to navigate by comparing the ground beneath them with a preloaded three-dimensional map. The second system, digital scene matching area correlation, would activate during the final approach, using an optical sensor to recognize the specific radar antennas. This combination of technologies meant that the 88 missiles could navigate through the winding limestone canyons of the Iranian coast, with an accuracy of within 10 meters. In the Launch Control Center, the technicians monitored the status of the booster rockets and the folding wing assemblies of each weapon. The Mark 41 vertical launch system was the backbone of the cruiser's offensive power, a modular design that allowed for rapid, sequential firing. The pressure in the launch canisters was precisely regulated, ensuring that the solid fuel rocket boosters would ignite the instant the firing signal was received. The sailors who maintained these systems were highly trained specialists, their hands moving over the controls with the familiarity born of thousands of hours of training. They understood that once the launch cycle began, the ship would fire one missile every 3 seconds until the entire 88-round magazine was empty. The commanding officer received the final status report from the weapons officer, confirming that all 88 missiles were in a ready-to-launch state. The tactical situation outside was deteriorating rapidly, with the Iranian fast attack craft now less than 10 miles from the cruiser's position. The Iranian boats were zigzagging across the water, making them difficult targets for the ship's primary 5-inch gun. On the bridge, the smell of ozone from the electronic warfare suites was overwhelming, a sharp, chemical tang that signaled the intensity of the digital battle. The ship was now a fully charged capacitor, waiting for the command to release its energy into the sky. The mission data for the strike was divided into 4 distinct waves, each time to hit its target from a different direction to saturate the enemy's defenses. The first wave would target the long-range Gaudier radars at Bandar Abbas, effectively blinding the primary surveillance node of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. The subsequent waves would focus on the regional command centers and the mobile surface-to-air missile batteries that protected the coastline. The precision of the timing was critical. If the missiles arrived too far apart, the Iranian defenses would have time to reset and engage the following wave. The coordination was being handled by the Aegis combat system, which acted as the brain of the cruiser, managing the complex flight paths of 88 separate aircraft. The final verification code was entered into the primary firing console at 6:12 in the morning. The tactical action officer looked at the commanding officer, his finger hovering over the glass-covered launch button. The world seemed to shrink down to the size of that single button, the sound of the ship's engines fading into a distant, rhythmic throb. The USS Philippine Sea was no longer just a vessel. It was a delivery system for a strategic message that would be written in fire across the Iranian coast. The silence in the Combat Information Center was absolute, broken only by the steady, electronic pulse of the radar tracking the closing enemy swarm. 6:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 60 miles off the Iranian coast. The command battery's release echoed through the internal circuits of the USS Philippine Sea, a finality that shifted the ship from a state of readiness to a state of active war. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer smashed the glass cover and depressed the launch sequence button. The air in the compartment seemed to vibrate with a low, subsonic hum as the ship's computers took control of the electrical firing pulses, managing a sequence that would release more firepower in 10 minutes than most nations possessed in their entire inventory. Outside, the morning sky was a pale, bruised purple, the humidity hanging like a wet curtain over the gray steel of the forward deck. The first Tomahawk cruise missile ignited with a sound that was less like an explosion and more like the world being torn in half. The missile shrieked off the rail of the Mark 41 vertical launch system, a white column of fire punching backward through the venting smoke and washing across the deck. The heat blast, reaching temperatures of over 2,000 degrees, bleached the dark gray paint of the launcher cells and sent a shimmering wave of distorted air rising 50 feet into the sky. The solid fuel booster roared, a deep, guttural bass note that rattled the teeth of the lookouts on the bridge and left the sharp, chemical bite of burning perchlorate hanging in the air. The missile rose vertically for 100 feet, its small wings snapping into place with a mechanical metallic click before it pitched over, and raced toward the Iranian coast, leaving a signature trail of white exhaust that blotted out the rising sun. As the first wave of Tomahawks climbed into the sky, the Iranian fast attack craft reached the 5-mile mark, their engines screaming at full throttle. The cruiser's forward 5-inch gun, a Mark 45 Mod 4, swung its long barrel toward the lead Iranian vessel. With the predatory grace of a cobra, the trigger was squeezed, the gun barked, a thunderous crack that sent a shockwave across the water, kicking up a mist of salt spray from the deck. The 70-pound high-explosive shell traveled at twice the speed of sound, crossing the distance in 4 seconds. The shell punched straight through the fiberglass hull of the lead fast boat, detonating the fuel tanks and the stored rocket-propelled grenades inside. A massive fireball erupted instantly, a sphere of orange and black that sent pieces of the engine and hull flying 40 meters into the air. The boat did not sink. It simply ceased to exist as a single object, its remains scattered across the surface of the Gulf in a rain of burning debris. The Iranian defenders reacted with desperate, frantic maneuvers. The remaining 31 boats broke their tight wedge formation, veering wildly to the left and right as they realized the cruiser was not just a target, but a fortress. One boat attempted a high-speed suicide run, zigzagging to avoid the 5-inch shells, its crew firing heavy machine guns into the air in a useless gesture of defiance. The 20mm Phalanx close-in weapon system on the cruiser's port side let out a mechanical growl, firing a burst of tungsten penetrators at a rate of 75 rounds per second. The stream of fire caught the Iranian boat at the waterline, shredding the hull like wet paper and killing the crew instantly. The boat swerved sharply to the right, its steering gone, before it slammed into the wake of another vessel and flipped end over end, disappearing beneath the waves in a cloud of white foam and diesel oil. Black smoke rose from the 3 burning wreckage sites that now dotted the water between the cruiser and the Iranian coast. The surface of the sea was littered with floating fragments of fiberglass and the slick, iridescent sheen of spilled fuel. The immediate threat of the swarm had been broken, replaced by a chaotic scattering of survivors who were now more concerned with evasion than attack. On the bridge of the USS Philippine Sea, the smell of burnt powder and the ozone from the radar arrays was thick enough to taste. The battle for the surface was being won. But the main event, the decapitation of the radar network, was only just beginning. The launch sequence continued without a pause, a steady thump-thump-thump of missiles leaving their cells every 3 seconds. The deck of the cruiser was now a landscape of fire and smoke, with 22 Tomahawks already in the air, forming a lethal line of white streaks stretching toward the horizon. The missiles flew at an altitude of only 30 meters, their onboard computers calculating the exact density of the air to maintain a speed of 880 kilometers per hour. The commanding officer watched the flight paths on the Aegis display, seeing the red dots of the missiles, converging on the foreign military coast like a digital wave. The first wave was less than 4 minutes from its targets at the naval port facility. 6:19 in the morning, the Iranian coastline near Bandar Abbas. The first wave of 22 Tomahawk cruise missiles was now a series of fast-moving shadows flying less than 30 meters above the white-capped waves of the Persian Gulf. The Iranian integrated air defense system, though partially blinded by the electronic noise of the USS Philippine Sea, finally managed to achieve a momentary lock on the incoming threat. At a concealed site behind the limestone ridges of Keshem Island, an HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery hummed with lethal energy, its search radar frantically pulsing against the digital fog. The air was still and heavy, the desert heat already beginning to bake the jagged rocks, but the silence of the morning was about to be obliterated by the sound of heavy machinery in motion. The Iranian battery commander gave the order to engage. The HQ-9 missile erupted from its vertical canister, a violent surge of orange flame and gray smoke that scorched the desert sand and sent a pressure wave rippling through the scrub brush. The rocket motor screamed, a high-pitched, deafening howl that shook the reinforced concrete of the nearby command bunker, and left a thick, acrid trail of propellant hanging in the stagnant air. The missile climbed steeply, its seeker head locked onto the infrared signature of the leading Tomahawk cruise missile, its fins twitching as it made micro-adjustments to its supersonic flight path. 4 seconds into the flight, the HQ-9 warhead detonated with a sharp, metallic crack that could be heard for miles. The proximity fuse triggered a focused ring of shrapnel that tore through the aluminum skin and the delicate internal wiring of the lead Tomahawk. The cruise missile did not merely fall, it disintegrated in mid-air. The jet fuel inside the Tomahawk ignited in a sudden, brilliant flash of yellow light that bleached the morning sky for a radius of 200 meters and sent a secondary shockwave rolling across the water. Fragments of the turbine engine and the shattered guidance computer were sent flying in every direction, tumbling toward the Gulf like burning meteors that hissed as they hit the salt water. High above the engagement zone, orbiting at 30,000 feet, an EA-18 Gulf Growler from the USS Abraham Lincoln monitored the launch signature. The electronic warfare officer in the rear seat reacted instantly, his hands moving with practiced speed across the touchscreens of his workstation. He depressed the trigger on his control stick, releasing an AGM-88 HARM missile from the underwing pylon. The HARM missile dived at 4 times the speed of sound, its seeker head homing in on the specific electromagnetic frequency of the Iranian HQ-9 radar. The Iranian operators realized the danger and tried to shut down their transmitter, but the missile's internal memory had already locked the coordinates. The AGM-88 smashed into the center of the radar van, the high-explosive blast wave crushing the steel structure like a soda can, and killing the entire technical crew inside an instant. A thick, oily pillar of black smoke rose from the desert floor where the Iranian radar site had stood seconds before. The debris from the destroyed Tomahawk continued to settle into the sea, leaving a widening slick of fuel and charred components. The immediate area fell into a temporary, deathly silence, broken only by the distant, receding drone of the remaining 75 Tomahawks still racing toward their primary targets. The aerial duel had lasted exactly 45 seconds, but the strategic cost was etched into the charred sand and the debris-strewn sky of the Iranian coast. On the bridge of the USS Philippine Sea, the tactical action officer reported the loss of 1 missile, but confirmed the destruction of the enemy radar site. The ship continued to vibrate as more Tomahawks left the vertical launch cells, their white exhaust plumes forming a bridge of smoke between the cruiser and the mainland. The Iranian military command was now in a state of total panic, their primary early warning eyes being plucked out one by one. The electronic warfare suites on the cruiser and the circling growlers were now operating at maximum power, floodloading the Iranian radio channels with high-decibel static and digital ghosts. The second and third waves of missiles were now crossing the coastline, their internal maps guiding them toward the secondary radar hubs at Bushehr and the command bunkers buried deep within the mountains. The Iranian defenses were becoming fragmented, their ability to coordinate a response hampered by the loss of their central nodes. The sailors aboard the cruiser could feel the momentum of the battle shifting. The professionalism of the United States Navy was being demonstrated, not through grand gestures, but through the cold, systematic application of precision-guided violence. Every minute that passed brought the Iranian radar network closer to total annihilation. 6:25 in the morning, the Iranian coastline from the port of Bandar Abbas to the nuclear industrial zone of Bushehr. The first wave of Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles had completed its low-level transit across the open water and was now making its final, lethal adjustments. The humid morning air, already beginning to shimmer with the rising heat of the desert, was suddenly sliced by the subsonic whine of the small Williams F-107 turbofan engines. The smell of the sea, salt thick and heavy, was replaced in a heartbeat by the chemical stench of burning jet fuel as the missiles flared their control surfaces for the terminal dive. This was the moment of digital realization for the Iranian coastal defense network. But for most of the operators on the ground, the realization came exactly 4 seconds too late. The terminal phase of a Tomahawk strike is a marvel of automated precision. As each missile approached its pre-programmed target, its internal computer activated the digital scene matching area correlation system. The optical sensor in the nose of the missile began taking high-speed digital photographs of the terrain below, comparing them at light speed to a three-dimensional map stored in its memory. At the primary Ghadir radar site near Bandar Abbas, the lead missile identified the massive, 4-story steel lattice of the surveillance array. The onboard computer calculated the exact center of the structure, adjusted the flight path by 3 degrees, and initiated a steep pop-up maneuver to maximize the kinetic energy of the impact. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead punched through the heavy steel girders at the base of the Ghadir array with the force of a freight train. The detonation was not a single boom, but a cascading series of structural failures. The high-pressure blast waves stripped the aluminum skin off the nearby electronics trailers and sent a sphere of white-hot shrapnel through the cooling units. The 450-kilogram warhead erupted in a blinding flash that bleached the morning shadows white, followed by a pillar of oily black smoke that rose 600 meters into the air. The massive radar lattice, weighing hundreds of tons, groaned as its support legs were vaporized before it tilted slowly to the west and collapsed into a tangled heap of twisted, burning iron. 30 miles to the northwest, at a secondary site protecting the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, 3 more Tomahawks arrived simultaneously in a coordinated time-on-target strike. The first missile hit the main power transformer, plunging the entire facility into darkness and cutting the feed to the Najm 82 phased array radar. The second missile slammed into the reinforced concrete roof of the command and control bunker, the tandem charge warhead boring through 3 meters of earth and steel before exploding inside the operations room. The third missile targeted the backup generator building, ensuring that the site would remain cold and dark for months to come. The coordination was so precise that all 3 detonations occurred within a single 2-second window, creating a triple shockwave that shattered every window within a 3-kilometer radius. The Iranian response was non-existent. With their primary surveillance eyes blinded and their command links severed, the local air defense crews were reduced to firing light anti-aircraft guns blindly into the sky. The red streaks of tracer fire arched harmlessly over the coastline, miles away from the low-flying missiles that continued to pour in from the sea. The systematic destruction of the network was proceeding with the clinical efficiency of a factory assembly line. By 6:35, 42 of the primary radar emitters along the coast had been confirmed as destroyed or non-functional by the orbiting reconnaissance drones of the United States Navy. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Philippine Sea, the tactical displays were changing rapidly. The red icons that had represented the Iranian radar threat were being replaced by gray X markers, signaling confirmed kills. The atmosphere in the room remained professional and focused, though a sense of grim satisfaction was beginning to settle over the crew. They had fired 88 missiles, and so far, 87 had reached their target zones. The technical data coming back from the satellite links confirmed that the Iranian coastal surveillance network was no longer a functioning entity. The Great Wall of Radar had been reduced to a series of burning craters and twisted wreckage scattered along 500 miles of desert coastline. The strategic landscape of the Persian Gulf had been altered in less than 20 minutes. The carrier strike group now had a clear, unmonitored path through the strait, and the Iranian military was left to deal with the logistical nightmare of a blinded coastline. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the dozens of smoke plumes rising from the mainland, the USS Philippine Sea began to reset its defensive posture. The mission was entering its final phase, the assessment of the damage and the preparation for the inevitable diplomatic and military fallout. The silence that followed the last missile launch was heavy, a stillness that masked the absolute devastation delivered to the enemy's doorstep. 6:50 in the morning. The high-altitude airspace over the Iranian coastline. Two RQ-4 Global Hawk surveillance drones were already orbiting at 60,000 feet, their high-resolution synthetic aperture radars cutting through the thick columns of black smoke rising from the mainland. The mission had transitioned from kinetic strike to battle damage assessment, a cold and clinical process of counting the broken pieces of a national defense system. The air in the ground control stations back in Nevada was silent, the only sound being the hum of high-powered servers and the quiet clicking of computer mice as analysts highlighted the charred remains of Iranian technology. Below the drones, the Persian Gulf remained a mirror of orange and blue, reflecting the fires that now dotted the jagged coastline for over 400 miles. The technical data arriving in the Combat Information Center of the USS Philippine Sea was absolute and undeniable. The infrared sensors on the MQ-9 Reaper drones, flying at a lower altitude of 15,000 feet, provided a close-up view of the devastation at Bandar Abbas. The primary Ghadir radar site, once a 4-story monument to Iranian engineering, was now a blackened crater of twisted girders and melted electronics. The thermal signature of the site showed temperatures still exceeding 500 degrees, the cooling systems of the facility having been vaporized in the initial blast. Surrounding the main site, the secondary trailers and support buildings were reduced to skeletal frames, their aluminum skins peeled away by the 1,000-pound warheads of the Tomahawks. The statistical summary of the engagement was relayed to the commanding officer at 7:15 in the morning. Of the 88 missiles launched by the cruiser, 87 had successfully reached their terminal targets, resulting in a 99% mission success rate for the weapon systems. A total of 42 primary radar emitters were confirmed as destroyed, including 14 long-range surveillance arrays and 28 localized tracking stations. Additionally, the strike had neutralized 12 command and control bunkers and 9 dedicated power substations, effectively fragmenting the Iranian integrated air defense network into isolated, non-functional cells. The coordinate points at 26 degrees 40 minutes north and 27 degrees 12 minutes north were now officially designated as cleared zones for the following naval transit. The most telling sign of success was the silence on the electromagnetic spectrum. The electronic warfare officers aboard the cruiser reported that the constant, aggressive pulsing of the Iranian radar network had been replaced by a dead, hollow static. There were no active search beams, no target tracking locks, and no coordinated radio transmissions between the coastal batteries. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was experiencing a total systemic collapse of their situational awareness. They were blind in their own backyard, unable to see the carrier strike group that was now preparing to move through the Strait of Hormuz with complete impunity. The logistics of the cleanup were already beginning for the Iranian forces, though the surveillance feeds showed little coordinated movement on the ground. Ambulances and fire trucks were visible at the larger sites, their sirens likely wailing into a landscape of fire and confusion, but there were no signs of technical teams attempting to repair the damaged arrays. The damage was too severe. The Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles had been programmed to hit the most critical components, the emitters, and the processor banks, which were impossible to replace without months of procurement and specialized labor. The United States Navy had not just damaged the network, they had deleted it from the tactical map of the 21st century. On the bridge of the USS Philippine Sea, the commanding officer looked out at the horizon. where the smoke from the mainland was beginning to drift southward over the water. The ship had successfully defended itself against the surface swarm and executed a strategic strike of massive proportions without suffering a single casualty or a single hit to the hull. The smell of the sea was returning, the salt air finally overcoming the acrid stink of burnt missile propellant that had clung to the ship for the last hour. The professionalism of his crew and the lethal precision of the Aegis combat system had functioned exactly as designed, proving that American sea power remained the dominant force in the region. The mission was a victory for the United States, but the commander knew that the regional shift in power would have consequences that lasted long after the smoke cleared. 8 in the morning on the 12th of March, 2026. The Central Persian Gulf. The USS Philippine Sea maintained a steady course of 180 degrees, steaming south at 18 knots away from the Iranian coastline. The intense, high-frequency hum of the engagement had faded, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a warship returning to a defensive posture. On the forward deck, the 64 cells of the Mark 41 vertical launch system were no longer a uniform shade of haze gray. They were scorched and blackened. The non-skid coating around the hatches bubbled and scarred by the heat of 88 rocket boosters. The morning air was beginning to lose its early dampness, turning into the dry, searing heat that defines the region, and the smell of salt spray was finally washing away the lingering chemical tang of the morning's fire. In the Combat Information Center, the crew was methodically closing out the mission logs for Operation Blind Eye. The high-resolution tactical screens, which only hours ago were crowded with the red icons of the Iranian radar network and the swarming fast boats, were now relatively clear. The silence in the room was a professional one, born of exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of a job executed to the highest standard of the United States Navy. The technical report was finalized and transmitted via secure satellite link to the headquarters of the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. The statistics were a testament to the devastating efficiency of the strike. 88 Tomahawk Land Attack Missiles launched, 87 confirmed hits, and a total of 42 primary radar installations obliterated. The casualty report was equally lopsided, reflecting the overwhelming technological advantage of the Aegis combat system. The United States Navy suffered 0 personnel killed and 0 personnel wounded. The USS Philippine Sea sustained no physical damage to its hull or superstructure, with the DAF only losses being the expenditure of its primary missile magazine and several hundred rounds of 5-inch and 20mm ammunition. On the Iranian side, the cost was catastrophic. In addition to the total destruction of their early warning infrastructure, 4 fast attack craft were confirmed destroyed with the loss of all hands, and dozens of radar technicians and Revolutionary Guard personnel were killed in the precision strikes on the command bunkers. The Iranian Great Wall of Radar was not just damaged. It had been systematically erased from the operational map. The strategic consequences of the last 3 hours were already rippling across the globe. With the Iranian coast now effectively blind, the Carrier Strike Group 5, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, began its transit through the Strait of Hormuz at 10 in the morning. The massive aircraft carrier moved through the world's most contested waterway with its radar systems silent, no longer needing to worry about the coordinated anti-ship missile batteries that had threatened it for years. The Iranian military command remained in a state of paralysis, their internal communications flooded with reports of destruction they could neither verify nor counter. The power dynamic in the Persian Gulf had shifted in a single morning, proving that the most sophisticated anti-access and area denial networks could be dismantled by a single, well-coordinated surface combatant. On the bridge of the cruiser, the commanding officer stood at the starboard bridge wing, looking out over the water toward the distant, hazy silhouette of a replenishment oiler appearing on the horizon. The USS Philippine Sea was low on fuel and completely Winchester on its primary offensive missiles, but its mission was complete. They would meet the supply ship at coordinates 25 degrees north, 54 degrees east, to begin the grueling process of rearming and refueling. The crew on the deck below began the process of washing down the VLS cells, the spray of high-pressure hoses rainbows in the bright Gulf sun. There were no cheers or celebrations. There was only the quiet, steady work of sailors preparing their ship for the next watch. As the cruiser moved toward the replenishment group, the final after-action report was logged into the ship's permanent record. Operation Blind Eye would be studied at the Naval War College for decades as a masterclass. In the application of precision-guided power, the Iranian coastline remained a jagged line of smoke and silence, a reminder that the eyes of a nation can be closed in an instant if they are used to threaten the peace of the high seas. The USS Philippine Sea disappeared into the side heat haze of the southern Gulf, a gray ghost that had delivered a message of fire and was now fading back into the deep.